morning, and good afternoon to in-house counsel from all across North America and the world. Welcome to In-House Connect. My name is Shai Mahani. I'm the CEO and co-founder of In-House Connect, and I'm thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you for spending your breakfast time or your lunch time with us, and special thanks to our wonderful sponsor, Summize, and our fantastic presenters today, led by Tom Dunlop, Electra, Japonas, and Tabitha Studebaker, for putting on a fantastic presentation on CLM fundamentals for in-house counsel, building a business case for contract lifecycle management. This is our 27th event of the year so far, and I'm wondering, are you here for the first time or have you been with us before? Poll results are about an 80-20 split, so 20% new and 80% returning. So welcome back to the 80% and welcome to the 20%. I hope you enjoy today's program. Okay, today's program is CLM Fundamentals for In-House Counsel, Building a Business Case for Contract Lifecycle Management, and our panel is led by Tom Dunlop. Tom is the CEO and co-founder of Summize, a Manchester-based high-growth digital contracting business founded in 2018. Having previously worked as an accomplished commercial and technology lawyer, including working as a global legal director for several fast-growth technology companies, Tom's experience with reviewing contracts was the catalyst that led to Summize. Having identified the pressing need to digitize and modernize the contract lifecycle management, Summize makes it easier and faster to review, create, and manage contracts. Our next panelist is Tabitha Studebaker. Tabitha is the Director of Presales and Contracting at Day Wireless Systems. Day Wireless Systems is the largest full-service wireless integrator on the West Coast of the United States. After joining the company in 2020, Tabitha made it her mission to find an innovative CLM solution for the business. And last but certainly not least is Electra Japonas. Electra is the founder and CEO of TLB, a legal design and operations company bringing law into the 21st century. In March 2021, she co-founded One NDA, an initiative that joined the legal community to create an open source standardized NDA. So we have a wonderful panel for you today. And with that, I'll turn things over to Tom to get us started.
I appreciate that, Shai. That's a great introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining. And welcome to the Building a Business Case for CLM. So we're going to cover probably quite a lot of detail today, and I'll run through the agenda shortly. We did send out in advance, and I'm not sure if people have seen this yet, but we have kind of a workbook, just kind of drawing your attention to that now, because I think it's probably quite a good guide to have to hand as we go through the session. It has certain kind of areas that you can actually interact with and start to write down some notes as you go along. If not, we can follow up afterwards as well, and it's a good guide to keep handy. The first thing I'm going to do, given we just led with a poll, is actually start with a poll just about CLM and if it's already in place. So the three options you'll see on your screen, we have yes, and we like our solution. We have a yes, but we're not sure it's long term, and no. I guess just to add a bit more color to the middle option, I think it's more if there's any functionality on any areas that you feel maybe slightly unserved, maybe there is a CLM that does a very good job of part of what you're looking for. That's an option there to do, just to get a feeling of what's in the room. It looks like there's quite a lot of people who don't have one in place, which is great. We'll talk about some of the, I guess, requirements you can do to get a business case ready for actually getting a CLM in place. We will also be talking about implementation of a CLM tool as well, and maybe some of the things, even if you already have a CLM in place, we will touch on ways to maybe expand use cases as well, which we'll hopefully find. So we're going to start the session with a quote today. So the quote seems a little bit strong in terms of being a Charles Darwin quote, but we are basically looking at a lot of change, I think, in the legal industry as a whole, and certainly as an in-house legal department. I guess there's more of an emphasis to be more efficient, and the term do more with less is regularly kind of quoted. And I think it really is the advent of tech starting to actually play a really strong role in the day-to-day practice of lawyers. So we've always had this quote in terms of, I guess, why we're even talking about, I guess, CLM, but tech more generally, and why it's important right now. Ultimately, it's the response to change. And I think it's a necessity that lawyers of the modern day practice, in particular in-house lawyers, are equipped to make that change and actually understand how tech, I guess, can make them work more efficiently. So, and with that, the way that we see it, we're going to kind of split the session into kind of four areas. So if you have kind of been talking about CLM or been to certain courses or seminars, I think a lot of people talk about the fact that tech is not necessarily a silver bullet, which we agree with. It's actually more to do with people, process, plus the tech, which is what we'll touch on. I'm also going to talk a little bit about a kind of fourth element, which is what I would describe as positioning. So we're going to talk a little bit about personal brand, a little bit about how you need to align with certain objectives internally. And also then, I guess, a key part of this discussion is about the ROI. How can you justify ROI of a CLM, for example, as well? So we'll try and use this sort of format, and also the workbook, which I mentioned before, reflects this format that you can then fill out the relevant sections as we go through the session. I feel like the intros have already been done to a very high standard, so I don't think you necessarily need to know any more about myself, but just the fact that I was an in-house lawyer for a number of years working in tech businesses, as I alluded to, that was the catalyst really that made me feel, there's got to be a better way. And that's where we co-founded Summize, which is a CLM solution a few years back, and we are mainly in the UK and US today as a system. I'm not sure, Electra, Tabitha, anything more you want to add on your introductions?
Sure, thank you, Tom. So I was also a lawyer in-house for about 10 years before I started TLB, so I'm very aware of all the pains that lots of in-house counsel experience.
Nothing else I would add. I've been with Day Wireless for a while. We don't have a legal team, so there's a different set of pains that come with that when you're contracting without the in-house legal that I have experience with.
Perfect. Thank you both. So the first part of the session, very much focusing on positioning. And again, I feel like I love a good quote. I'm using quite a few throughout the session. Some of you may feel this is a very famous quote of a very famous author. It was actually myself that made this quote. This was basically when I was in practice, I looked to, I guess, create a mission statement or something that the legal team as a whole could try and believe in, that as to the value that we added. I think a lot of the time, in-house legal are often banded with the kind of risk management, I guess, brush, and everyone thinks of, who is legal. And I actually overheard someone describe me as just Tom from legal. That was their description of my identity in the business, which was quite a sad day for me. I thought, well, I feel like I give a bit more than just Tom from legal. So what I started to kick off is a bit of a, I guess, internal rebrand of what the legal team were perceived as. So we got this kind of quite short, hopefully quite snappy sort of mission statement. The real thing that I wanted to get across with this, and this comes back to the sort of personal brand, how do you want to be perceived in a business, was the first statement, which is, actually, we're here to maximize company value. And yes, we want to reduce potential risk, but it's the first statement that we really wanted to kind of emphasize to the business. The reason we wanted to do that is what people probably didn't realize from things like the contractual negotiations that we were doing was actually we were turning maybe some loose commercials that may have been agreed into a really powerful contract, thinking of things like how long does it be? Is it exclusive? Is there minimum volumes? Can we secure revenue for a period of time? And there's a story with a fintech that I used to be a part of, where I did this really long contract negotiation. And actually, I was really quite proud of myself that of the kind of risk management provisions, the limitation liabilities, the indemnities. I came out of that thinking really proud of the kind of risk management side of it. Actually, but when we went to the business, we didn't communicate any of that. All we communicated and focused on was the fact that we'd secured essentially the visibility of our services on our partner's website. It meant that we managed to secure, I guess, the digital presence of our brand on a very, very kind of well-known website, which would guarantee leads. And the reason we did that was we were kind of controlling the news flow of what legal did and aligning it to some of the work, but really kind of telling the story around this first part of the statement, which is maximizing that company value. And the reason I do that is because I think it's really important that, coming on to the next quote, which, whether you could argue this person is of equal status as Tom Dunlop is Jeff Bezos, I believe. But what this is about your personal brand, and I think what's important, particularly when we're in the context of trying to get budget or looking to get an ROI, looking to justify, I guess, spend within a team, the reality is that decision is potentially going to be discussed in a room where you're not there. And this is quite a famous quote that I always took to heart, that how are they going to describe not only this particular business case that you're putting together, but the actual value of the legal team as a whole. So I think actually one of the things you can do when you're thinking about building a business case, and this is for anything, it's not just legal tech or CLM, is really start controlling that personal brand and what exactly you want to be known for. And that could start with a mission statement. It could then start with how certain work is filtered out through the business. It could be that you have a snappy sort of elevator pitch that anyone says, well, what does legal do? You have a one-line statement that you're always reinforcing those key value proposition that the team brings. And this is all groundwork that can be laid. Actually, when those seeds are planted, it really, really can help when you actually go for things like budget from the relevant budget holder. The second part is of our kind of positioning section is about alignment. Now, I kind of have a funny story about this to do with my daughter. It's quite a recent one. She's only 7, called Olivia. Her friend has TikTok on her phone. You're probably wondering where I'm going with this, but you'll get it at the end. But basically, she was recording a TikTok video, and I saw them doing it, and they were doing this dance, and I tried to copy the dance, and I thought I was being quite a cool dad. I thought I could keep up with the young kids. And they filmed the video, and I was quite happy with myself. And then I actually saw the video later because it actually copies across to our OneDrive. And actually, they'd kind of recorded some commentary over the top of it, sort of mocking me as a bit of an embarrassing dad. So it was one of those moments where, I thought I was being a nice bonding session. I thought I was doing really good. Being a cool dad, actually, we weren't very aligned in what the purpose of that video was. Bit of an anecdote for you to understand the power of alignment. But in this context of a CLM, and certainly getting that kind of, I guess, budget approved in ROI, one of the other things that we can start to do as a team or as individuals is actually matching the tool or the budget that you're looking to get from to things like the company vision or the company mission. I always found it actually switching to being a CEO rather than being the GC or the legal director is very powerful when people come to me and say, we need budget for X because we're trying to do, I guess, this activity that aligns to our company vision. So we might have certain metrics, we might have a certain target as a business. If you align to the company vision and mission, there's a good chance that your actual pitch is going to be aligned to the company as a whole. But I think the next thing is probably the most important, which we see, I guess, is not always followed sometimes, which is who is the actual budget holder. Oftentimes with legal, it may be the CFO within a business. And to kind of talk about an anecdote on budget holder in a previous company I worked at, this was a SaaS business. Actually, the CFO, the biggest metric that we were measuring our company on was revenue per employee. Now, that seemed to be the number one metric that mattered to the business. So when I'm pitching a solution, obviously it's about efficiency, which is great, but actually the one thing they didn't want to see is an increase in headcount. So I had to position my entire business case all around the saving on headcount and how that would ultimately benefit the revenue per employee metric that the CFO was sort of obsessing over at that particular time in the company journey. Now, that's really important because if you'd gone in there and talked about how efficient your lawyers could be, how much more work they could do, potentially how much growth that could enable, that would actually not be aligned to what the budget holders' objectives are for the company. The final part of, I guess, positioning in terms of the first section, so we've had the kind of personal brand, we've talked about alignment. In terms of ROI, I'd split these into kind of 2 different categories, certainly of what we see in my experience. So I actually designed this slide deck when it was St. Patrick's Day. So for some reason, there's a 4-leaf clover. This seemed to be the most appropriate image to describe what I was trying to achieve. But basically, if you happen to stumble upon any of these, I guess, particular examples, then you're very lucky to be able to use this in your business case. So the first one is there an event, for example? So is there a investment event? Is there obviously an exit? Usually associated with that, there's specific budgets, integration budgets, or budgets to do with a takeover or any kind of M&A, and that you can actually plug into if there's a value associated with that for the particular tool. And obviously our background was actually summarizing contracts. So you can imagine in that scenario, sometimes that'd be very useful to pull on that budget when there was that sort of M&A investment event. The second one, and this is extremely common, I'm sure most people watching would have probably come across this, is a missed auto renewal or calendar dates. That could actually be key obligations missed as well. But usually there's a financial consequence of that. The amount of times when I was working in-house and someone would come over and say, oh, we didn't want to spend money on this particular service or tool, showed me the contracts, and lo and behold, we'd missed the date that we could terminate and we had to agree to another year. Now, as soon as you've got things like that, that's a great immediate thing that you can point to and say, well, look, for this CLM, we're no longer going to get the problems with missed calendar dates. We would have saved X, so it justifies the spend in itself. The final two are kind of quite similar. It's basically the first one, which is more of a HR employee use case, but this was probably more common in the boom of where hiring people was really hard. And ultimately, the speed of the process actually sometimes won out. And I think at that time, if you missed an employee or if you didn't manage to close an employee because the process took too long, let's say the HR team couldn't quite generate the offer letter and employment contract quick enough, again, it's ROI that you can point to say, well, actually, particularly in the case of certain CLM tools, if we can self-generate these documents, maybe with an approval, that efficiency is going to mean we're not going to miss out on that employee. Or the final one is, and this happens quite regularly as well, I missed out on a deal. Let's say that you couldn't turn around a contract fast enough because of the backlog and the bottleneck. Actually, if you missed the deal, whether it was in quarter, in the financial year, or actually you lost the deal altogether, immediate ROI that you can point to. We're not all that lucky, though, to get these, I guess, one of the leaves of the four-leaf clover that might mean that the ROI is justified quite easily due to a past event. So the hardest way to do it is when someone says, look, this is going to make us more efficient. And I think the job of tech more generally is to obviously provide efficiency of some description. Now, for me, for this, what I found to be extremely effective is trying to make sure the efficiency links to the biggest pot. So what I'm going to give is a few examples. Now, typically, this is what I think lawyers in particular or legal teams tend to lead with. So we're saying that this software can make us 20% more efficient. In the ROI example number one, we're saying, well, if the legal team could be 20% more efficient, so therefore they can reduce their workload by 7 hours per week, we can save X pound per attorney based on a salary range. That means, let's say, £36,400 per annum. Now, that sounds okay. That's an ROI. You're justifying a figure. That's fine. But actually, if you do it slightly differently, and rather than just start with the legal team can be more efficient, if you then relate it to the business, and particularly future growth, most businesses have a growth plan over the next few years that they want to achieve. So let's say in this scenario, they want to grow by £100 million over the next 3 years. When you break that down to understand, well, how many contracts are you likely to review to actually get to that, to X amount of million pounds of revenue? So in this instance, if it's £25,000 as a typical order, we'd do 400 contracts for every £10 million of revenue. Now, each attorney, if they currently review 200 per annum, what you could say is, well, we need less attorneys. Now, when I was talking before about revenue per employee for my CFO example, that would have been the one to lead to, because I've said, well, actually, to get to the growth plan, I actually need 4 less heads than probably what you budgeted for. Well, that's great news for a revenue per employee. However, if we're in a growth market or there's certain different metrics to go, I'm thinking more on the CRO side, COO side, depending on the influence in the business. But let's say that the actual metric, and again, the same efficiency, because of this, we could actually review more. We could be more efficient as a team. And when you go to a business level, that could be £1 million of business per attorney of extra growth. Now that suddenly these figures are becoming quite big. And for a business case, going from 36,000 to 1 million, and actually the efficiency that we're talking about is the same, is kind of a 20% increase in efficiency. It's just reshaping, I guess, one, who the budget holder actually is and what they want to see, but also trying to make sure that it's the biggest pot possible that the efficiency relates to. In summary, for the first section on positioning, and again, looking through the workbook, there are sections for each of these that you can start to write down ideas or think about. But the first one, I think, is a general point that I think anyone can look at, which is the personal brand. What is that brand of the legal team? How can you create either a mission statement to align to, or alternatively start to really filter out into the business, kind of what does legal do? What do they say when you're not in the room? The second, alignments. Don't do TikTok videos with your daughter. That's one lesson you can learn. But also you can understand your objectives in terms of the efficiency or the CLM that this has been aligned to, aligned with the budget holder's objectives. Again, think about that revenue per employee metric that the CFO might want, that might be a counter to the actual ROI you're looking to prove. And finally, from an ROI, you've either got the 4-leaf clover, which is essentially that kind of, you're very lucky if you can, I guess, point to a historic event that gives you immediate ROI. Alternatively, if you have to justify it on efficiency, look for the business metric, look to the future to support growth. and ideally look for the biggest pot that you can tap into. We're going to hand over to Electra.
Thanks, Tom. Some really great examples there, and a couple of them I will be stealing for my next presentation. I hope that's okay. So, as Tom said, it's really important that you position yourself appropriately before you embark on your CLM journey. The other things that you need to consider are more operational. So at TLB, what we do is we help clients implement CLM and to get ready for that project. And I think that one of the most common misconceptions is that CLM is very much plug and play. And unfortunately, that's not the case at all. It's not a point solution. A CLM touches many areas of a business. Contracts are a business tool. They're not just a legal tool. And so for that reason, it's really important to understand that CLM is not plug and play. And on that basis, there are things that you need to do in order to prepare for it. But also, when you roll it out, it's important to consider who your user is. And we'll go into that in more detail in a minute. We also know that one of the biggest risks to a CLM project, once you've decided to go down that route, is that often the project team or the decision maker around whether or not to proceed with CLM isn't that clear in what their objectives are. Often people will think we need a CLM because we need a contract repository. Others will think it's because we want to automate some of our documents. Others think it's a good tool to have in the event that you're audited. It's really important that you clarify what your objectives are. And by all means, you could have various objectives, but what are your objectives to begin with, and what do you need to prioritize? And it's really important that those objectives are clear in your head first, and then that you're able to articulate those to the broader business so that you can bring them with you on the journey. And that kind of feeds into the next point, which is that often we don't see a project team or a plan. So we appreciate that CLM and the legal innovation and tech space is more nascent than, for example, the tech that exists in HR or finance. And so often lawyers aren't necessarily fully prepared for this thing that they're about to embark on. But what's really important is to have a project team in place and people that are going to help you deliver this. This isn't something that you can do, alongside your day job without any plan or project team in place in order to deliver this and with clear objectives. And then because there is no project team, there is no stakeholder buy-in. So it's really important, if you're aiming to do this, that you have your idea of what success looks like and who you need to bring with you on that journey. So things to consider are, who will this affect? Is it finance? Is it HR? Are those people even in scope for my pilot? Who is going to be impacted by this? Who needs to be bought into this so that they can do the right things and get people on board so that this project is as successful as possible? The other risk that we see is that there are too many requirements. And I think as lawyers, we're prone to doing that, to thinking about all the eventualities and putting a really long to-do list together and things that we need to hit in order for us to say that the project has been successful. But actually, when it comes to CLM or any level of transformation, actually, it's really good to have a very clear, small remit that you use as your proof of concept. And this feeds into something that Tom said earlier, which is your personal brand. So what you want to do as a legal team is to really find the pain point, the quick win, and then assess what the best first course of action is. What will your POC be? What will be the thing that if you do successfully, others will see that you're doing things right and they'll want to see more from you? And if you can scope out a bite-sized chunk of what it is that you want to achieve with that CLM and then point back to it and say, look, we succeeded in that objective, then that will help people come with you on a journey to expand the scope of the CLM and roll it out to other areas of the business and have a bigger impact. Another thing that we see that isn't great is that there's no process mapping. So people think that they're going to buy a CLM, they're going to plug it in, and it's just going to work on the old processes, or you can just have the processes that you already have, but you digitize them. That's really not the way to go about it. Buying CLM is a golden opportunity for you to rethink the way you do things. And that includes things like, should you really be doing all those NDAs, or should someone else in the business be doing them? Start thinking about who should be doing things and how these things are currently being done, and then start to map those out. So what's the now process situation? Who does what and how does that all happen? And then try to simplify. So that takes us to the next point, which is often we see teams trying to digitize complex processes and contracts. So again, this is a golden opportunity for you to really simplify the way you work and to layer that with tech in order to get the best outcomes. There's no point in you taking a process that may or may have not have worked in the manual world and trying to apply tech on top of it, because you're actually perpetuating the issue. And one of the examples that I always bring is that, you know, back in the day when we didn't have Word documents that we could very easily edit, contracts were only about, you know, 2 or 3 pages long. People would have to write them out. There was a lot of effort, and actually things kind of worked. But then because we layered that process with technology, it became very easy for us to expand on those agreements and make them bigger and bigger and bigger. So we've taken a manual analog process and we've digitized it, but it doesn't necessarily work. So rethinking the way that you work and trying to simplify before you apply technology is a really good idea. Otherwise, you risk perpetuating the issues that you had with the initial process and making them even worse, because now they're just easier to execute on because they're automated. Finally, it's really important that you have a comms plan in place. Who are you going to communicate with? What are you going to say to them? How do you get them bought in? And what's the thing, again, something that Tom mentioned earlier about the budget holder and what the budget holder is interested in. It's important to think about the things that you're solving, the issues that you're solving for each of the people that you want to come with you on this journey. So if you're finance, then maybe you want to know that with the CLM, you will have more insights around when contracts are coming up for renewal. And so you'll be able to forecast your spend or your income, your revenue over the next year. So that's something that finance wants to know. Or for HR, they have different interests. So think about who you're communicating with and how you're going to do that. And then finally, CLM is not a 2-week job, it's a longer job. And depending on the size of your organization, you will need time. So make sure you factor that in when you're doing your strategic planning for the year. Okay, so what do you need? We talked about all the things that you should be considering and what you shouldn't be doing. What do you need? The first thing is project resources. And by that, I don't just mean funds for the CLM. It's important to have in-house people that can remove barriers and blockers for you and who are change makers and that are really going to bring people with them on their journey. The second thing is templates, agreements that are really long and convoluted and unnecessarily negotiated don't do really, really well in CLM. It's an important milestone, CLM, and it's an opportunity for you to say, okay, let me look at my templates. A, are they as simple as they can be? B, are there things in here that I keep negotiating and I always fall back on a position? If so, then I should change my position and I should change my, my recorded risk appetite to align with what's happening on the ground. So if you say that you never accept unlimited liability, but actually you do, then perhaps that's something to change in your playbook, which takes me to the next point. Once you've redesigned your templates, think about your playbooks. Have you recorded your preferred positions anywhere? And are you able to point back to something that says what your preferred positions are? A playbook will also allow you to empower other people in the business. So if you have a really simple template and a really good playbook, then there's no reason for you to have to create all the agreements that go out of the business. And there's also no reason for you to review every single contract that comes in. If you have very clear parameters, it could be that you empower procurement to do it or sales to do it, or that you can create playbooks around more complicated templates and have more junior members in the team that take on more of the negotiation and the review of the contract. So setting these tools, putting these tools in place is really an important thing to do before you introduce CLM. And then finally, communications. Make sure that you're thinking about your audience. Who do you need to bring with you? What messages are you giving them? Tailor your message so that it lands. Think also about things like, what's the average age of the people in our organization? How do they like to be communicated with? Do they like Slack or do they like a long email? Do they like a document or do they like a Miro board? So depending on your audience and how each of those engage, make sure you tailor your message. Otherwise, you risk that it doesn't land. So on that spotlight on comms, I cannot stress how important this is. And often we'll see projects that go on for a year or two and the tech works really well, but there's no adoption That's really the biggest risk with CLM. Adoption is paramount, because if people aren't using the tool, or if people feel like it's just an extra step in the process to engage with legal, when often legal may hold a reputation that we're in silos, or that we aren't that embedded into the business because we work with our own processes, this is an opportunity for you to show people that that's not the case, and that actually you are fully embedded in the business and you understand the way they work and operate, and you want to operate in a similar way. So think about your user, think about your demographic, think about who's in the different departments, how they want to be communicated with, methods, style, and how you're going to deliver it. And then finally, keep it simple, because often as lawyers, we understand all the nuances and intricacies of why we need a CLM, why it's good, what the business case is. But if you're communicating with different parts of the business and you want to bring them with you on a journey, then that's the way to do it. Keep it simple. And finally, this is a launch plan, and Tabitha, I plan to bring you in on this, because this is a template launch plan. So firstly, you'd have your use cases and processes confirmed. So this is before the launch. You have your final checks completed, then some legal training around what it is that you are going to be doing, business training so that the business understands how you wish to engage, and then you launch. And then after you launch, you iterate. So much like with any product, once you've launched it, you want to find out how people are perceiving the tool and how they're engaging with it, and you can use that feedback to iterate on the way that you've put the tool out and make it better and more user-friendly. Tabitha, I'll now hand over to you, because you've had real life experience with CLM and your own journey.
Yeah, absolutely. For what I'm going to speak about, I'm going to pick up on steps kind of 1 through 4 of what we're showing here on my slides. So
I think we'll run a short poll prior to the, I guess, people section. So here you'll see a number of options. I guess what we're really looking for here, and there may be multiple pain points, but I think it's really to understand what is the biggest pain point around contracts. Obviously, storing them, finding them, always a pain, and that's usually one of the catalysts to look for a solution. But actually, the real pain can often be in the communication with the wider business, the actual, the intake process, how manual it is to actually review them, the structure. There might be clunky, very long contracts. A lack of data. Legal's often left behind in this regard. I always found that every other department in the business had their own tool, had their own data analytics. Their board slides always looked really impressive, and legals were hard to make look impressive, or obviously already using a CLM.
I had a question for Electra. Who, you talked about stakeholders and different budgets, and Tom, you talked about this too. Is there, a typical department that owns this process or owns CLM aside from legal? And, I think of procurement, I might think of finance in terms of controlling the purse strings and the budget. What do you typically see, in your experience?
We typically see legal buying CLM. We sometimes see procurement as well, and Tom can also talk to this, but we see legal buying it because legal want it, and the business case that they bring is it's going to make legal more efficient. But actually, again, sorry, Tom, keep referring to your presentation, because I think it's great and you raised some really important points. If you can stress to leadership that CLM is going to help them achieve their business objectives, then that's exactly who you want buying from. You want the leadership team to be completely bought into this journey, because it's complicated, and you want them to be able to remove barriers for you, just with any transformation project. And that's what CLM will encourage, a bit of a transformation for legal. You need these people to remove the barriers. So leadership is one. How are you going to help them achieve their strategic objectives? But then you've got the other teams on the ground who you want buy-in from, because they're the ones that are going to influence the people on the ground to use CLM after it's being implemented. So finance, HR, procurement, the CTO potentially, because they might get involved in things like infosec forms for contracts, etc. So that's the stakeholder mapping piece that you need to consider and tailor your message accordingly.
Definitely. And we have a question in the chat. Can a CLM framework be used for litigation or patent management?
I think from my side, we often, I think it kind of relates to the previous point, which is, I think CLM is CLM is a very wide topic, I guess. It covers most of the business departments, but also quite a long process from the creation of a contract through review, negotiation, signature, manage, and then ongoing management thereafter. But what we often find is the initial use case comes from somewhere, whether that's coming back to the poll, they can't find signed contracts, or they want people to self-serve on NDAs. And then the more people you get involved, you find that there's potentially a use case across the entire business. But I think that's where sometimes scope creep happens and the requirements become too broad. And I think this is often procurement get involved and send out and kind of gather requirements. So and sometimes it can be 100 different things that a tool needs to do. And I think looking for a tool that could manage all of those different use cases is a dangerous path to go down, in my view. I think that if you're looking for a specific bit of technology that could help with patent management, for example, it's really what is the pain with patent management? What is the specific bit you're trying to solve? And the chances are it might be better because it's more specific to that pain to get a tool that specifically does that, for example, rather than trying to get a CLM functionality to adjust to that as part of a wider scope, is what I'd say.
Got it. So I'm sharing the polls, and you can recap, and back to you, Tom.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I guess we've covered positioning. We've looked at process, and I think part of the process and people are very much linked to both parts. It's a bit about people, and over to Tabitha about actually the real life experience of rolling out a CLM across the business as well. So I will just get it to your slides. There you are.
Thank you, Tom. And to build a lot on what Electra was saying and Tom was saying earlier, I've been invited today to talk about my personal CLM implementation experience and how my company handled it. So as stated a little bit earlier, I'm with Day Wireless Systems. We're a communications solution company. We're based in Oregon on the West Coast of the US, but we have 30 locations, and they're all on the West Coast, but we do nationwide as well as globally. So we see a lot of contracts. And what I was dealing with was manual contracts. So every contract was coming to my team manually. So what I had to do was create a plan. And as you can see on here, I have 3 primary steps that I took. And much like Electra was saying, the first thing I did was identify my priorities. What was my team's specific needs? And so for us, that was faster. How can I get contracts through the process quicker, but diligently? How can I read, review, and respond expediently, but efficiently? The volume kept coming in, but there was still just one person reading them. So that was the first problem that I had to address. The second priority I had was, again, time consuming, but roadblocks on very simple standard documents that my company considers standard: NDAs, MNDAs, MSAs, all those acronyms that we know and love. I needed to get those out to my associates quicker. There wasn't a need for me to block. How do I get through that? And then also, it was mentioned earlier, consider the age of your company, consider who you're working with, consider what they can work with. My company has been around since 1910. Sometimes it feels like the employees have also. A lot of technology can be like fighting things. So for me, it was absolutely imperative that it was seamless. That was a priority of mine, not just what it could do, but the fact that it would be used. So the next thing I did after I had my priorities identified, and feel free to put questions in the chat, by the way, I'll try to answer those, or we can answer those at the end. Second thing I did was create that timeline. That's very important. Things to think about when you're creating your timeline that I found very quickly was, is this solution replacing another? Now, that could be a process or an application. So it's important to determine how to properly sunset that. Who's involved in that process? Who needs to be involved in that process? How do you get those people connected? Identify your stakeholders. When do they need to be involved? And the other thing that's very important is training. How is your team going to get the training they need to utilize the CLM? And is your team doing the training for the others, or how is that being considered? So my timeline was all around how was this going to roll out? And of course, once that was created, we engaged the team. We rolled out a plan and provided updates, and I made it a team effort. And so on the next slide, I show our implementation plan. So for Day Wireless, we made an action plan that included scheduled milestone. And for us, it was a 90-day approach. On days 1 through 30, we started that buzz internally, and we generated excitement and highlighted our favorite features. And how we did that was we had a cadence of an email that announced those features. Internally, we used Yammer, so we were able to kind of get with the different groups, let them know about the features we thought they would like. If they had any questions that we could bring back to our team. During that time, we were onboarding with Summize, and we were doing all of our training, uploading our templates, getting all the information, creating a playbook, everything we needed to be able to roll this out to our team. That's the launch plan that Electra showed as well, kind of the steps before the launch. This was what we were working on. And then in days, I guess before I go into days 31 through 60, we had already decided to split the users into rollout groups. So on days 31 through 60, users were divided into rollout groups that got their training and all their information given to them. For us, that's based on usage. We kind of tiered out who needed this, who had the highest priority. They became our beta group, and we let them roll through things as we rolled through things. We kept our existing process. We didn't sunset it, so we could compare and contrast, have that great case to show everybody that everything was working, it was doing what we needed, and then we were able to roll out the other groups. And so then we did that in our plan, and by day 90, everything was launched. Everyone was using it, and it was a success. So not a whole lot more to add to that.
Sounds
That's a
textbook.
good. I was going to say it's a good place to end there with success. That's always a good place to end that part. So the final section, I'm conscious of time, is to leave some time for questions as well at the end, is around tech. So a lot about positioning, process, and people, and it's really a follow-on from the kind of different things that have been said to date. But I thought I'd get creative this time with a star, just to illustrate. Got very creative with this presentation. The kind of 5 different areas. So we talked before about the requirements, being really specific about what you actually want to achieve from tech in general or CLM. And I think sometimes that list, as Electra alluded to, where I think lawyers by nature want to cover every aspect, and maybe that requirements list gets very, very large, very quick. If we keep it really simple, I think you could probably put things into 5 areas. So the first, and this was actually, by the sounds of it, a really #1 requirement for Tabitha as well, which is the UI. And I don't mean that as in, has it got a nice UI? What I mean is that, are the users going to be interacting with the product in a familiar UI? Does it need to be in a tool that they already use, because otherwise they just won't adopt it? And I think putting yourself, because a CLM is likely to touch multiple different departments, multiple different personalities, you've got to put yourself in their shoes and think, will the tech work in an environment they're comfortable with? Ultimately, if they're happy to go to a new platform and learn that platform, then great. But if not, and they prefer to work in Salesforce or Teams or Slack or those type of environments, and then try and make sure that the tech actually lends itself to being in that kind of UI. The second is, I put self-service, but I think the point here is more about, is the tech actually making you more efficient? And this is actually a really common thing that we found, that introducing tech is great. And I think Electra talked before about digitizing a bad process. But sometimes what we find is that when people have got workflow tools, for example, what they're actually doing is increasing the velocity of requests that come into the team. So that wasn't the problem. Actually, that was the bottleneck, was that there was too much volume going into a team, but that couldn't be dealt with effectively. So actually getting a technology product that's increasing velocity but not doing much else isn't going to stand you in good stead. And that shouldn't necessarily be a key requirement of a tech solution. On the counter to that, if you look at it, can a tech product actually alleviate the work for you? Can it create self-help? Can it create enough guardrails that means, the sales team can self-help on basic agreements, as we've already alluded to, or certain people in the legal team, maybe more junior, can be more efficient in their review because you give them the parameters that allows them to essentially self-service and not have to get it second checked. The third is measure. So, you're buying tech generally because of efficiency. And one thing that is actually often overlooked is does the tool actually allow you to measure the effectiveness of the efficiency that it's bringing? So, for example, if you're looking to increase the volume of contracts that you might be able to review, do you record that? Do you have an SLA turnaround time? We used to review this many contracts, now we review this many. Can the tool enable that if you were to get the full benefit from that tool? Because it's important to validate the assumptions that you made when you made the business case, which we talked about earlier. The fourth, which is a poorly put together image I put together, is about data extraction. So contracts are very data rich, as we know. So certainly in the CLM case, does it actually automatically extract data or allow you to report on it? So coming back to the point about the board report, you've got a shiny new tool. Does it allow you to then report up to the board with some stats? And does it automate that? You don't want to just be basically presented with a load of field that you have to fill in manually. You could do that in other forms through Excel spreadsheets or whatever it might be. So does it actually extract data and provide that level of automation? And finally, which I guess is related to UI to an extent, is it actually easy to use? So I think look past the buttons, look past the design, like actually think about your specific use case, getting from A to B, doing a particular task. Is that task easy to use or is it not? Now, it's a lot of people, a lot of tools will say they are, and a lot of them appear nice because of the design, but actually functionally for what you need to do, is it easy to use? I think if you follow just these 5 different parts to looking at tech, rather than building up a lot of functionality requirements that might go to the very specifics about what a button would need to do, you're not going to go too far wrong with actually solving the pain that you're looking to solve through buying some technology. So that is the 4 areas: positioning, process, people, and tech. Now it's really over to see if there's any questions.
Awesome. So first, first of all, thank you, Tom, Electra, and Tabitha for a great presentation on implementing CLM and giving us a view of some of the pitfalls and areas to think about. Aren't the UI and easy to use parts overlapping? So what's the difference between UI and easy to use?
Yes, to an extent they are, but I think the way that I would articulate the difference is, one is kind of how the physical buttons and the design of the page that you're on looks and feels. Is that easy to use? The second, in terms of UI, is a little bit more nuanced. That's actually how are you using the product? So a good example, we are lawyers. A lot of people like Microsoft Word. It's no secret. So does the tool try and replace Microsoft Word, or does it sit alongside Microsoft Word? Now, the reason I say that is, as a user interface, Microsoft Word is familiar, so it doesn't drive change. Even if the design and the easy to use aspect is solved in another way, and they've designed a really nice looking editor for a particular tech vendor, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right UI to be using for that use case. Actually, you probably need something that makes your reviews in Microsoft Word more efficient, for example. So they're similar, but they are slightly different. One is where you work, the other is how easy it is to operate.
Great answer. It seems like the audience, the pain points are contract intake and handling contracts manually, right? Which obviously, if you have a CLM, that changes. So just talking about contract intake, how would that work with a CLM? And let's say, you get contracts from different areas, Slack and email, and, maybe you have a portal. How would, Summize, or how would Summize help that? And do you have recommendations for somebody who wants to implement a CLM and has all these various areas where contracts come in?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's a good question, because I think a lot of people think of CLM very much as a post-signature tool. So they look at it as a repository. They think of it as a place to store signed documents. But sometimes you might not check that part of the CLM actually that regularly. That's not necessarily the day-to-day struggle. So looking at the sort of pre-signature, or the legal front door as it's called, isn't necessarily a part of every CLM as such. So I think if that is the pain point, ensuring that is actually a functionality that's provided by the CLM is important, because that's the bit that potentially is the pain. For me, and for the way that Summize approaches as well, is is about centralizing those requests. It's actually having a central front door. So rather than having multiple different, whether it be emails or a portal or Teams and Slack, it's about centralizing that. We do actually use Teams and Slack. So we have applications that are built into Teams and Slack, which acts as that legal front door. It's obviously its own application, so it's secure, but it automates that kind of capturing of information. So coming back to earlier about, you don't want to digitize a bad process. You don't necessarily want to just make sure that a tool gets it to you quicker. What you probably want is a bit of qualification first. So does it allow you to gather information? You know, those questions that usually go back and forth by email, where it's like, well, I know I want to review a contract, but who's it with? What's it for? How much is it for? Like, where are they based? If you want to ask those contracts, and ideally you get them in advance, does the CLM provide that functionality? Is an important question to ask of the vendor. Like, we have that conversation in Teams and Slack through Summize before it gets to legal. So it's actually allowing you to get the information gathered in an automated way, rather than having to have that back and forth each time.
Got it. And then as far as, handling contracts manually, I guess this is a two-parter. For companies that want to ramp up and bring in a CLM, how do you make that transition from manual to automated? Do you have any recommendations in that regard? And I'd love to hear, Electra and Tabitha and how, you've done that in the past.
I'll start with a brief answer, but I'll pass on to the experts. So for us, the way that we approach it is that there's probably two very different types of review where efficiency is important. One is like a red flag review, which is actually, you don't want to do a red line, you don't want to mark it up in Microsoft Word, you just want to know what's in there. And so part of our product summarizes that, which is obviously an efficiency saving in that scenario. Sometimes if you do a lot of markups or red line contracts, efficiency actually in the markup might not necessarily be the key driver, because it's a big important contract, it's high value. You might not want to necessarily automate the red line itself. A lot of that, actually, the efficiency is in the playbook or the information gathering. It's about having access to the right information at the right time. And I think that we see that so much that when you actually watch someone do a red line, a lot of the efficiency, they don't want to be more efficient. They want to read every line. But then when they find something, it's, well, what now? Like, who do I escalate to? Or what's our backup position? So it's very much touching on the kind of points before about, have you reviewed your templates? Is there a playbook? If not, there's things that are out the box with what TLB and Electra provide. They're in the product. But having access to information, again, in things like Microsoft Word can actually be equally as efficient as actually the automated stuff.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think that there are two types of contracts, right? There's third-party contracts, and then there's your own paper. If it's your own paper, the way to go from manual to something more sophisticated is firstly to simplify your agreement as much as possible. Secondly, prepare it for digitization. So move all the variables to the top and then keep your boilerplate at the bottom. Simplify the language, make sure that you're not negotiating unnecessary things, and then build a playbook that will really clearly outline how people can negotiate that agreement. To Tom's point, what the fallback positions are, who to escalate to. So the playbook's not just something that gives you answers, it also provides you with a flow in the event that things aren't exactly aligned with your preferred positions. If it's third-party agreements that you're reviewing more often, then a playbook is great, but in order to get to that playbook, you need data. So start looking at the contracts that you've reviewed, where you have the most pushback on your side, and then use that to create a playbook. And Summize is great because you can have that all on one page. Whereas, before, when we had a playbook on Excel, you had to flip between Excel and Word, and it was really clunky. But with tools like Summize, you can just have it on one side, and having everything in one place is really helpful.
I would just add that it is all about the playbook. That was something that my company didn't have. Being completely manual and making that transition to going digital, that was key. We spent a lot of time building that, doing a lot of Q&A, looking at old contracts, determining, hey, we do have a standard position. We do always fall back on this. Without really a lessons learned log or a playbook monitoring that, you don't know that as quickly as you would with the playbook. And like with Summize, you were saying, that's now we review, and as we've created things, we build upon it as well. So it's growing with us as we learn more of these things, and we can always have them accessible. So I just reiterate the playbook. It is definitely all about the playbook.
Got it. I want to talk about metrics for a minute. We didn't have a chance to talk about it, but can we touch on metrics? What kind of metrics can we get from Summize? How can you use it in, maybe the lack of metrics is something that can be used to help build a business case.
Yeah, we usually find that, if I'm honest, is that almost finding the state of play, as in almost like how efficient are we as an organization, is often hard to track. So sometimes you don't have a foundation to necessarily measure from. But I think sometimes that's why when we're looking at ROI, it's looking at the bigger picture. It's looking at how many, in a sales organization, it's probably easier, like how many were stuck in a particular phase, such as procurement, for example. How quick did a particular deal or sale progress through that stage on average? And sometimes that can be captured by the CRM that you might use. So it might be a Salesforce, or it might be another system. And that gives you a starting point to say, well, to do this much revenue, we are taking this long on average, for example. And that was quite effective to build that base case. Then it's about, part of the legal front door being so important is it gives you it starts to build up the business case, or it starts to build up a understanding of efficiency within the team. So once you centralized it and you understand that you've got, everyone in the business might submit through the, Teams or Slack, and they get the questions, and we can then start to measure from a product perspective, the moment it gets, submitted through to legal, we can automate some of the workflows. We can also spin up things like tasks automatically. So that next step of who does what can also be automated. And we can track then how long it takes to close certain tasks, or how long it can be from start of request to the close of request. And that can be by type. So if it's a creation of a document, if it's a review, or if it's just a generic, ask legal a question. And then you start to understand not only the volume, but also how efficient individuals are in the team, but also things like the team as a whole for sales, for example. So you can do it by that kind of user group. So you really get quite granular analytics, actually. And because that's all captured automatically, the first thing you need to do, or the big step, is centralizing it, getting it all through one place. The moment that happens and you've got a central, single legal front door, there's a point of measurement, and then from there analytics are quite easy to get. But I think some of the other metrics, just to touch on very quickly, Playbook is actually one that we have started to release quite recently, which is actually measuring the effectiveness of Playbook. How often are you looking at particular issues? How often are you inserting particular clauses? So that information is really interesting, because if you don't necessarily do a full markup, but you're looking at what the issue is, that's quite hard to track in Microsoft Word, for example. But because we can start to track some of that through our add-in, that's opening up the insights into, what are we always negotiating? Why do we always spend the time looking at these same 4 issues? Maybe our playbook and our templates need to be refined to make sure that we don't spend so much time on these 4 things. And that's a different area of analytics that probably hasn't necessarily been as obvious before, but things like tech can open up. Well, Electra, you look like you were going to say something then.
Just to add to that, we hire these legal ops teams, and the point of those teams is to optimize the way that the legal team operates. And it's really hard to do that without data that will allow you to make decisions to remove the friction from the negotiation process in an agreement. An example I gave earlier is the unlimited liability cap. We see that a lot. People say to us, we will never accept an unlimited liability, but then they do. So if that is something that you will accept, then why not just change your risk threshold to allow for a more transparent negotiation? Some companies have all these fallbacks, but if you have the data to show that in 50% of instances you always go to fallback 2, then why bother with having fallback 1? And I know that as lawyers we're trained to always try and get the best outcome, but often the best outcome is a quicker negotiation process and a signed deal rather than the most risk-averse position.
You can't have a CLM talk without talking about AI, right? So is AI used in your solution? And if so, how? And maybe tease the future of AI and contracts.
Yeah, definitely. AI is obviously we're very interested. We've been a kind of AI sort of review products in the market for a while, and we kind of have also experienced the power of things like the GPT models that have come out. So most people will be familiar with ChatGPT and the different versions that have been released. We probably approach it slightly differently to others in that the way that we do it is we look at how relevant particular parts of contracts are to clauses, for example. So we work out the context as a product. So our internal I guess, algorithms and AI is looking at relevance of parts of the document to clauses, and we're able to say, for termination, for example, this is the most relevant bit. There's also 2 or 3 other bits in the contract that are very relevant. From that, we can extract certain things. So we can extract, durations and dates, and this is all, automated through the system. Where some of the power has come more recently, and things like GPT allow us to add on and enhance our AI, is where there might be, indemnities is a good example, or liability caps we touched on before. Usually there's multiple parts of a document that might relate to that particular concept. So there might be 4 indemnities, and there might be something that looks a bit like an indemnity, but maybe it's not quite as severe, for example. What we're now able to do is, because we are able to find these things in the contract and order them in relevance, we can then use things like GPT to give you a really succinct summary that's in really natural language, and not just natural language that a lawyer might read, but actually how you then translate that to a business user is all done automatically. So I think for me, that's been a huge shift in certainly how we use AI. Is not just about finding parts of a document or finding context in text. It's a lot about the output now. It's about how can we now turn this really useful information into something which, a business user could understand, or a client, for example, for a law firm. And that's the generative AI that is really starting to take over. I think the only word of caution I would give with things like the GPT models, because we play with them a lot, is where it's being used as a kind of blank template, and you want to go to GPT and say, right, generate me a contract that does X, Y, and Z, or you're looking for it to, find advice on a particular contractual issue rather than a playbook, for example. I think a lot of people are still finding in that scenario that it's not 100% trustworthy, that where it's getting that information from to generate that initial draft or to give you that advice isn't always referenced, and it's hard for you to take that as words. So we've backed off any of the generative AI parts that are to do with using its data set. Instead, what we're doing is feeding it data that's contextual and relevant, and asking it to allow us to then send that to business users, for example, in a really natural language, easy to understand way.
Do you anticipate AI being used upon intake, maybe to analyze, a contract and compare, and like this provision is not up to standard, or something like that?
Yeah, I think we have been exploring a bit more, and I know that Electra is very passionate about this as a concept, which is, rather than people negotiating contracts based on wording, as in, every lawyer words things very differently, actually negotiating based on principle. And I think that that's a huge shift that will hit the legal industry in terms of principle-based both drafting and negotiation. And I think things like AI and whether it be GPT or how that's incorporated, and we're looking at that in conjunction with playbooks, is how can you understand the principle behind a clause, and then understand what the difference is between the principle of what it's saying and the actual wording, rather than just do a red line to make it sound more like how you would phrase it. I think that's a big use case and shift that we'll see.
Very cool. Electra, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to echo what Tom said, I think that as lawyers, when we're reviewing contracts, we're using 2 parts of our brains. In the first instance, we're assessing whether what the clause says is actually what you want to achieve as a business. So there's a commercial assessment and a risk review. And on the other hand, your more pernickety side is looking at whether you like the drafting, whether stylistically it aligns with what you want, whether there's words or commas in there that don't necessarily align with your expectations. So you're doing this 2-part assessment. If we can remove complexity and review contracts based on a functions level, so what does this clause actually do, and then standardize, ideally in an ideal world, we'd standardize all the boilerplate language and we'd all just plug it in to reflect the position that we wanted. That would be, and I think, a great use case for ChatGPT, but that would be an ideal scenario for the future of contracts.
All right, great. So I guess we're out of questions. I want to ask the panel for, final remarks, closing remarks before we break for the day.
I guess the overall, if you're considering implementing a CLM, it's plan, kind of like what Electra was saying. It's not plug and play. You need to have a plan in mind. You need to know who your stakeholders are. Round that up, though, get people involved. This excites a lot of people. You'll find that you think it's just you who's interested in it, but once you get the person from finance involved, they also are really passionate about this too. And so open it up, be transparent with it. That's that's my advice.
Got it. Electra.
I'd say treat CLM like the golden opportunity that it is. It can pave the way for you to almost transform your legal team. So to Tabitha's point, it's very exciting, and it can add immense value to your team, but also to the wider business. So go for it, and it will help you scale.
I guess we've covered a lot of information in today, and we tried to put that into the 4 sections to make it easy to follow and understand. So they're kind of people, process, tech, and positioning, which is a good framework to use when thinking about this. I guess the one closing remark is that don't also believe that that's the base that you need to hit. We're giving a lot of information. I think sometimes people get quite overawed, think, oh, well, we're so far away from having all of these things in place. This isn't a checklist to say you can't do CLM without that. In fact, it's oftentimes we work with customers to help them get to that point. So don't worry if it's completely manual. These are just, I guess, the food for thought to try and categorize how you can get more prepared or make the most out of this, hopefully amazing tech that people can roll out.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tom, Electra, and Tabitha for a great presentation. A really helpful framework on CLM. And folks, if you enjoyed the program, drop into the chat, let us know. I hope everybody has a great rest of the day.